Yeah, again, thank you for the invitation. And I will kind of give you a very brief overview of what I'll talk about here. I'll explain a little bit about BBC News Labs, where this work is coming from. I will kind of go into the background or the context for the news environment as a whole in the digital ecosystem, and how that impacts a public service broadcaster like the BBC, and I think also most news organizations, and then build on that towards this idea of personalization, and the necessity of personalization in the digital ecosystem. And then at that point, I'll get into some very specific projects that we've done in BBC News Labs using artificial intelligence to generate a particular kind of personalization around new story formats. And then I'll wrap up with a brief look at where this might be going in the future. So to start, just BBC News Labs very briefly, we're this team of about 20 people that sit at the intersection of very large organizations within the BBC. So the news organization, the engineering organization, the product organization where I work, and the R&D organization, and we're in this intersection point. So we're a cross-functional team. We're funded by these organizations. We report up into these organizations, and we have a very fast-paced prototyping way of working, where we do about 3 or 4 projects every 8 weeks, and then we do another set of projects, and then another set of projects. So we're continually churning out prototypes that we use for audience testing, for testing with journalists, for evaluation in different ways. And then we also do a communication function, both within the BBC and externally. So this is the sort of the context that this work is coming from. So to step back and take a look at what's happening to news generally, news has gone through this dramatic disruption that's basically caused by this phenomena, or this change, which is the change from an environment where there were very few organizations or entities that could broadcast information to a large number of people, and that was this old world where you needed a television station or a printing press or a distribution network to communicate news. And we've transitioned to this new world, this new digital network world, where everybody can communicate anything to everybody else on the planet at any time. And that's a very fundamental change. It's change in the shape or the topology of the communication environment. And it's kind of at the heart of so many of these problems that we're facing in news. And one aspect of that is the change in essentially the power over the communication ecosystem, which used to reside with the broadcasters and the publishers in the past, because they owned the sort of the scarce thing, whereas now increasingly in the digital world, that power resides with the platforms, who control the ways in which everybody talks to everybody else or communicates with everybody else. And that's the sort of the context that we're coming to from this. And so for us in the BBC, this leaves us with a legacy of essentially pre-digital workflows and cultures and artifacts that we're essentially trying to transition into the digital environment. So for example, our flagship news programs are generally kind of one size fits all. We do have regional versions of news, but in general, we have kind of one news broadcast that the entire country kind of consumes at 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock every night. And that really is one size fits all down to the time at which it shows. In our text, we have a one size fits all product, which is essentially this kind of wall of text. And this is kind of surprising in a way, because the BBC only got into text production of news during the digital era, but a lot of the techniques and cultures that were brought in to do that were from the legacy print world. And so we have this kind of essentially pre-digital format, this wall of text. And these are not really accessible to more and more people. You have this environment the willingness of news consumers, or even the ability of news consumers to consume text at this kind of level, that is diminishing. And so the core of our challenge is that we used to have this idea of the audience, a single audience, which was kind of tied to the people that watched the television channel or the people that read the newspaper. And we don't have that anymore. What we have now is this. We have these very, very diverse audiences. And as a public service broadcaster or news organization, the BBC has to cater to all of these. We have to serve all of these diverse audiences. And we have to do that in the midst of unbelievable competition for attention. We are that little dot way up there on the top of that chart in this map of the major websites of the world. And so the amount of competition that we face for the attention of our users is almost infinite. And in order in terms of the tools that we have to engage in that competition, we have a single website and a single app. Not exactly, but broadly speaking, that's the case. And so what this sets up, it sets up this challenge for us, to which the only feasible solution is to personalize what we do or adapt what we do to fit those diverse audiences. And so personalization is in a very real way a kind of a structural necessity for serving universal public service news to the diversity of audiences that we need to serve. So given that we have to personalize, well, what is it that we can personalize? We can distribute different stories to different people. So this is recommender systems or ranking of news stories differently for different people. We can format or present the stories differently to different people. So we can tell them differently in different ways to different people. Or we can assemble the stories themselves in different ways for different people. And what I'll talk about here is mostly this one, which is about the formatting or the presentation of stories in different ways for different people. And this is not just a aesthetic choice that people have. It's a very fundamental necessity for facilitating different consumption behaviors. So some people like to consume a lot of news and just get a small amount of the essential information about each story. Some people like to consume a lot of detail about individual stories. Some people like to consume news visually. Some people are doing other things. Maybe they're driving or they're listening to their headphones and they need news in an audio format. So, some people are very systematic in their news consumption. Some people are very kind of snacking and browsing in their news consumption. These are all different consumption behaviors, and we have to facilitate those. So an example of how one of our competitors does that, this is the Daily Mail, and this is specifically about the formats for news. They have essentially 5 formats on their page. Their headline is a format. They have these very, very long headlines that essentially tell the gist of the story in a single sentence, sometimes as much as 40 words long. They have these bullet point versions of stories where the entire story is summarized in between 4 and 8 bullet points. They have a lot of text. They often have 1,000 or 1,500 word text articles that they're basing these on. They have image galleries where they tell the full story in a set of images with captions, and they have video versions of the stories. And each of these is not a decoration or an adjunct to the article. Each of these is a way to fully consume the story in different ways and at different granularities, but to fully consume the story in and of itself. At the BBC, generally, not entirely, but generally, we still have essentially a single format. We have this wall of text, and then we have an image on top, which is a decorative image that does not tell the story. It just supplements the text article. So we need more ways to tell stories so that we can genuinely serve the diverse audiences that we need to serve. And we do a lot of experiments with different kind of forms of news stories, and when they kind of come down to production ready or near to production expressions on the website, it looks something like this with bullet point versions and image galleries and so on. But the challenge here is how do we create those different formats using our approximately existing workflow? And there's kind of three ways. So one way is to do it manually. We can have every story created in every format by hand. Another way is to fully automate it. We could use algorithms to format the formats or to create the formats from the existing output, say from the existing article. But we haven't chosen to do those. We've chosen to do this semi-automated approach where we use our journalistic talent to modify slightly the existing workflow and operate at a higher level of productivity using essentially AI tools. And so these different techniques are used by different news organizations, but the one that we're pursuing is the semi-automated version where journalists or existing journalists are in full control, but their abilities or their productivity is augmented using these tools. So an example of that is the work we've done on our bullet point stories, which we will be launching into production this summer. And so the starting point for this is the article. So the existing workflow produces an article. We use that article as the starting point. And then we use several different summarization techniques to extract bullet point summaries from those. And so these are for abstractive summarization, which is essentially rewriting the article in a set of bullet points in its entirety. We use the Google Pegasus language model for that, which is designed for summarization. But we also use extractive summarization, where we take key sentences as written from the article to represent the story. And we have a system that we've developed to enable journalists to develop and explore this space. So this isn't just a technical project. This is a project where we provide this playground to journalists and enable them essentially to control the kinds of models and the strategies that those models use to generate different kinds of summaries. So they can use the full array of artificial intelligence tools to determine how those tools create those summaries. And we call those strategies, and we have this system for tracking the different strategies that are possible that teams come up with for summarization. And these have different advantages and disadvantages in different situations. So that's one example of how we can sort of take these AI tools and use them to augment the ability of journalists to produce these bullet point summaries. And then, of course, each of these has a sub-editing portion. We don't publish directly from the algorithm. The bullet point summaries are created, and then the journalist edits those. We do something similar with visual stories, and these are for image galleries, where we use extractive summarization for this. And then we do named entity extraction and topic extraction from the summary. And then we use those in a search strategy within our internal image database, which we call BBC Images. It's based on the Guardian's grid image database, which is open source. And so we have an interface with that API, and we search within that API using those extracted entities, and then we use those to select the images and then caption the images to create a draft image story for the journalist to use. So again, we start with the article, and then we end up with this draft image version of the story that the journalist can edit if they choose, and then make the decision to publish. We've even done this with comics. So again, starting with the article, we've built this system where we can assemble comics mostly automatically, just directly from an article. And so what we do is, again, we extract topics and named entities from the article, and then we match those to this catalog of components that we have and assemble the comics that way. And those components at the moment, it's just in the health domain. But this strategy has been fairly successful, although it's only in the very early testing stage. This is the workflow or the architecture for this. On the top there, the top right is the tool where you basically put you basically put the article in as a starting point, and it generates the draft comic strip that's between maybe 8 to 12 panels, and then there's an editing panel for the individual images themselves. Each individual panel can be edited, so the journalist can control the text and can control the imagery as well. So again, it's article in, generate the draft, journalist edits the draft, and so this is the assembly, the combinatorial assembly of those components into panels is an expression of AI here. So what these techniques are generally doing is they're taking the existing workflow, which normally just produces articles and then those are published, and it adds this mechanism which uses different forms of AI to produce draft output of some kind, whether that's a bullet point summary, an image version of the story, or a comic version of the story. Then there's a very quick editing workflow that the journalist is engaged in at that point, and then those are published. So we get multiple different formats to communicate our stories to different audiences in different ways. We get those more or less from our existing workflow. That's the general idea here. Traditional journalism was very straightforward. The journalist produced the article, and what I've talked about here is using traditional journalism, producing the article, apply some automation, and then create different versions of the story beyond the article. And we can extend that to things like video and audio versions of stories quite easily. We've done quite a bit of work with that. But there's another possibility here, which is that you have to ask why we're using the article, which is an artifact that first appeared in the 1640s. Why are we using the article to generate all of these new digital formats? Is the article the best unit to use to generate these formats? Because there's a limit to how much information we can extract from the article in order to assemble these formats. And so there's this possibility that's very tantalizing here, that there's some other artifact of news, and the word that we use internally is a story model. There's some other artifact of news that if we could produce our journalism in that representation, then we could more easily and more fluidly generate many other different formats, including articles. So this would be produce the journalism in a representation, and from that representation produce articles as well as other things. And those of you who have been involved with automated journalism from data will recognize that workflow quite well. That's essentially how automated journalism works. The journalism is essentially in the data, and that story model is then turned into an article using template-based natural language generation. So that basic model is something that is increasingly in our mind. So this requires some fairly structurally different infrastructure in the newsroom, and the big structurally different piece of infrastructure that it needs is a content management system that can work with modules and assemble things in terms of modules rather than as a single big block of text as an article. And these I call these post-article content management systems. The big one that people are familiar with in the world is the Washington Post's ARC content management system, which is a modular, recursive content management system. It is not being used for much of this at the moment, although it's designed from the ground up to be used in a modular way. In the BBC, we have our own version of this. We call it Optimo, and it is kind of the basis or the platform in which we're taking a lot of these new formats and new kind of opportunities for automation into production, because it's based on modules that have a purpose rather than a single block of text. So are there some other techniques that we can use as a starting point for news for new formats for storytelling beyond the article. Of course, there are. We've done some initial work with what we call structured reporting. So structured reporting is a technique where you are authoring into kind of blocks that are special purpose and that are tagged in a special way. We do this for explainers. We have a tool called Explainer Builder, for example. We use this in bots. And this ties into a broader set of technologies that come out of the technical writing world called structured authoring. There's a set of tools around this. There are conferences about this. There are communities around this. And so that ability to structure the reporting, although it's very, very nascent, that is one additional way that you could simplify or semi-automate the assembly of these new story formats. We've done this internally in News Labs in several projects. Another way, as I've mentioned, is using data as a starting point for new story formats and obviously for new stories. So this gets into personalization of the assembly of stories themselves, as well as just the story format. So this is automated journalism or natural language generation from templates. And essentially it works like this. The data is the source of the story that's assembled into some kind of a story model or a journalistic idea of the important elements from that data. That gets passed through a natural language generation template, which is this abstraction of the patterns in the story. And then that is used to automate the generation of many different articles. And we've used this quite a bit in the BBC. On the right there are some of the stories that we published from it. And we've also taken that concept to video, where we've taken the text output from natural language generation and used that to drive synthetic audio and also synthetic video versions of stories. So these are examples of places where you can start with data, and this is not going to be a useful tool for most journalism, but it's a useful tool for a substantial minority of journalism. That is a way to kind of feed these different ways of storytelling to reach these new audiences. And then there's more and more tools that are available with which to do this. There's this ecosystem that's developing around synthetic media, and the work that we've done in labs uses some of these tools. For example, we use ARIA for natural language generation. We use Synthesia for our automated video. Some of the language models that we've been experimenting with are coming out of places like OpenAI and Google. And there's a whole range of these tools that are available to assemble news and other information in different ways, in different formats. And so this combination of automation in the workflow around the journalism and automation or semi-automation in the assembly of these expressions or formats of the journalism, that is a large and growing sort of field of opportunity with which to reach people who are not being reached with the wall of text or the 6 o'clock news on the television. So where does this go in the long run? I'll just say a few words about that. And I think this quote here, it's a bit of a cliche, but I think it's true, and it's worth emphasizing that it's very easy to look at a lot of these tools now, for example, synthetic video, and to look at them as toys or as kind of small and simplistic versions of news that are never going to be important, because news as we know it now is mostly articles and television programs and so on. And it's very easy to dismiss a lot of these new formats that are happening around the periphery of newsrooms. But the problem is that in the long run, those technologies and tools at the periphery can have quite an impact. And we've seen that at large with the internet in its entirety. But that's also something that appears again and again and again. And so I think that's definitely the case here. It's very easy to get maybe too excited about these in the short run, in the short term. But over the long term, say the decades time frame, the effect of these technologies could be very substantial. and more specifically, I think it's maybe useful to look at this in terms of a potential new kind of disruption of media. And so news media has had this disruptive era for the last decade or two that has been driven essentially around the disruption of the distribution of news. So when everybody was able to publish news to everybody else, that disrupted the key monopoly that news organizations had, which was around the distribution of news. They owned the television transmitters, they owned the printing presses and the vehicles that delivered the newspapers to the shops and so on. And then when that disruption was of distribution, when that came through, that sort of triggered all of this rolling crisis over the last decade or two in the news world. And so that disruption was about different ways to distribute familiar artifacts, articles and programs, or articles in audio and video. And one of the aspects of that was that because that power relationship changed from the publisher and broadcaster to the platforms, that the platforms came to own more and more of the consumer relationships. And so what I'm going to suggest here is that there's perhaps a second wave of digital disruption that might be coming. And it's not based in distribution. That wave is kind of over or is complete. This wave is about the content itself or the artifacts that make up news. And it's not clear yet what those artifacts might be. It's very hard to say what this environment, this synthetic media environment and automation environment that we're all heading into, what that might throw up in terms of stable forms of news. But I think that's a real possibility. And I think where that would show up in newsrooms is in personalization. And this is not to say that everybody gets different news, or not entirely, but it's to say that the way in which news is communicated and the context of news and the experience of news could be quite different for different audiences and different people. And this has a really good outcome in one way for news organizations, because in that kind of environment, you can't separate the artifacts from the infrastructure that produces the artifacts. So in the existing world, you can separate articles and radio and audio clips and video. You can separate those from the newsroom, and they're separated all the time. Whereas in this sort of new environment, those tools for publishing are tied to the databases and the workflows and the processes that enable them, and you can't just index them on Google and go and consume them in a separate relationship. You actually have to have that relationship with the producer or the news organization. So that's one way that things may develop. I'll stop now and see if anybody has any questions.